Zack Davis from Lyceum, how are you?
I'm great, Royfield. How are you?
Not too bad. I used to think that I was the OG of educational podcasts, but you probably have taken the crown now because you run an organization, a thing called Lyceum. What exactly is Lyceum?
I'll never be the OG like you, Royfield. I walk in your shadow. Um, but I love educational podcasts. I love this community that we're a part of, and basically every day I get to think about how to help it grow. And obviously, we have a conference called Sound Education, and from that conference, it inspired a new initiative called Lyceum, which tries to find all sorts of ways of supporting educational podcasters. So we have an app where we're curating great shows. We have tools that people can use to engage with their listeners. And we're making new shows too with creators and talent and professors.
So, where exactly did that idea come from? Because I know back in the day, you're a podcaster, a history podcaster. That's specifically the genre which I'm really close to. And you're working in isolation. Then you said, "Okay, right, I need to collaborate and whatever." And so various, podcast rings and associations were kind of built. But yours is much more, dare I say it, of a business as opposed to an altruistic thing. So, where did the idea come from, and what exactly is the business model behind Lyceum now?
So I started podcasting in 2017, and I wanted to help all these amazing professors that I was getting to know in Boston teach more people. And so I started a podcast called Ministry of Ideas, and
Mm-hmm.
each episode was sort of a different audio essay. But when I got started, I didn't know the first thing about audio, actually. I sort of came from a more scholarly field. And to get it off the ground, I ended up finding collaborators. I found people who knew how to edit. I knew people who knew how to work with audio scripts, um, and all of that. And the experience of working together with a team to make something that we were all proud of, and that helped people out in the real world, that experience is something that I just love. I love working with other people. I don't really like working by myself. And so after a year of doing the show, I was thinking, man, we've learned a lot, but there are so many great shows out there. Like, we ought to be coming together to teach one another and to share war stories. And so that's why we put together Sound Education. Um, and so that experience of bringing hundreds of creators, of podcasters, and their fans together, um, in one place, I had the feeling of, we are in the process of creating a new university,
Mm-hmm.
a university that doesn't live in ivy covered walls, but that lives in our commutes with our favorite voices and our favorite teachers, who help teach us our favorite subjects. And so that idea that we're creating a new university was pretty powerful. And, we all know there's lots of problems with current universities. Um, they're either really exclusive and elitist and only serve a small number of people, or they're very, very expensive, or they treat adjuncts really poorly, pay them nothing. Um, or the entire mode of most universities is not about love for the subject, but a kind of like deconstruction, skeptical standpoint, where lots of people want to fall in love with topics, fall in love with subjects. And I started seeing a lot of that in the podcast I was listening to. That there's enthusiasm, there's excitement. It doesn't mean it's totally naive, but it had a different tone, and I think a tone that a lot of listeners were growing to love. And so after the first year of Sound Education, um, I started working at a podcast company called Himalaya that was building some really good tools to help podcasters earn a living from their shows. And I started thinking about, man, I wonder if some of these tools can be Hey, buddy, I'm in an interview, okay? I wonder if some of these tools can be useful for all of the community that I've fallen in love with the educational podcasters. And so me and some other friends and collaborators decided to use Himalaya's technology and build a new platform called Lyceum, a platform that can serve the listeners and the creators of educational podcasts.
Like, be honest though, right? You must have like a whole list of podcasts, and you're like, oh my god, I want that podcast to be on Lyceum because I love it. I want that one, not so much. So, tell me the top 3 podcasts, educational podcasts, that have inspired you to get into the whole world of podcasting.
Well, there's more than 3. I'll try to limit it. So one definitely was Philosophy Bites. I started listening to that in 2014, 2015. And being able to listen to short episodes about Nietzsche and Kant and all these great philosophers was amazing. I loved it. So that was an inspirational one. And then I met 2 Boston-based podcasters, Wade Roush and Tamar Avishai. And Wade creates a show called Soonish about technology, and Tamar creates a show about art history called The Lonely Palette. And both of them have been collaborators and inspiring friends, and have led the way. And then one more podcast is Doug Metzger's Literature and History. And what he was doing with the show was so ambitious and so incredible. In fact, I reached out to him about sound education, and he became one of the co-organizers and has become a close friend. So my current favorite right now is a show called The Constant. And it's just an amazing history show, full of humor, full of history, full of philosophy. But there's so many that I love.
What is it specifically about The Constant which is different from, let's say, a Communal Garden podcast about history or philosophy?
Well, it's presented through stories, and we all prefer stories to reference works. Encyclopedias are rather boring to read. So he's an amazing, Mark is an amazing storyteller. But the stories are done with, a lot of skill in the presentation and the writing, a lot of humor, but they'll always talk about really deep questions of human life, whether that's institutional oppression or the way that we think about truth. They're just brilliant works. In some ways, I think it's one of the finest examples of how the medium can be used that I've come across.
And were you able to sign him up for Lyceum?
Yeah, he's working with us. He's great.
Okay, so your journey into the whole world of podcasting is pretty interesting, because for you it wasn't just a case of I have something to say, give me a microphone, I want to kind of broadcast it, but one of the things I like about what the content that you produce is the fact that it is so thoughtful. Philosophy is such an integral part of it. What you think, ways of thinking, ways of analyzing the world. I'm guessing that that's what you did at Harvard. There's got to be philosophy was your major. Please tell me I'm right, because otherwise my train of thought of thinking is completely derailed.
No, you're right. I did a lot of philosophy and philosophy of religion, but I see myself as a historian of ideas.
Mm-hmm.
You can also say an intellectual historian. So I'm interested in how ideas emerge, how they change, how they transform, and how they have an effect in the world. And I think it's important to know the history of ideas, because none of the things that we think of came out of a vacuum in 2020. They have long prehistories. They've been influenced by many other factors. And I think just like with any aspect of history, the power of history is not like as a guide or a map for what the future will hold, but as a reminder that everything is contingent. Everything that we do or think has a history and can be changed. So if there's things that we don't like about our current society, it's not predetermined. It's up to us to make a difference and change those things.
So for somebody who is, let's say, an infant in the world of philosophy and the history of ideas, give us some pointers along the road to do with the history of ideas, to do with the history of philosophy. If you had to think of, let's say, three figures of which I know nothing about anything, Zach, right? You know, I'm barely even a podcaster, right? Give us three philosophers and the reasons why people should study them and why they're important in the whole history of ideas.
Well, philosophy can seem like a very forbidding subject. Seems really dense, really hard to read. And that in some cases is true. I mean, reading Kant or Hegel, that's you gotta be ready. But it's helpful to think of, I mean, all philosophy is it's a conversation about who we are, what does it mean to be human, what's the nature of reality, and how can we live? And it just asks big questions. So every single person really is a philosopher. Every single person has to ask those questions about the life that they're living. And great philosophers, they just end up having really good answers, really persuasive answers, or at least they ask the right questions that help us think about life differently. So, I mean, everybody should read Plato because they're written and they're very readable. They're dialogues. It's like reading a chat room. So Plato is one you can't go without. I think Nietzsche is an incredible writer, very funny, very poetic, and he foresaw a lot of the issues that we're dealing with as modern subjects. Um, and then, yeah, I mean, Kant. You can't understand the modern world without reading some Kant. So those are three really important ones for sure.
So if you had to, so Nietzsche, Kant, and Plato, I know enough to know that all of those dudes are dead, right? Are there any modern philosophers, people who are alive and kicking right now, that you think in 100 years plus, people are going to be referring back to their work and saying it was seminal to understand the human condition and 2020?
Well, a couple come to mind. So Charles Taylor is a philosopher who has thought a lot about what it means that religion has declined so much in the West. And so, his book, A Secular Age, I think is, absolutely one to look and read, and I think will last a very long time. Um, Richard Rorty thought pretty deeply about pluralism, and I think a lot of us are thinking about how can pluralism work in tension with equality. And the great legal theorist John Rawls really established a lot of the legal theory for jurisprudence equality. And so I think he'll be one that people read for a long time, although he has passed away.
Ralph GT, who's watching us right now, says maybe Schopenhauer.
Yeah, he's one of the greats for sure. An amazing pessimist, and it's easier to go through life and not be disappointed if you're a pessimist.
Being British, one of the things that fascinates me about your country is how ideas play a central part in the formation of the nation state, what it is to be free, to be American, and also notions of fairness. I'm putting you on the spot now, but the Supreme Court it's not a unique institution to America, but which of those justices, because they are philosophers, aren't they? They read the text of the Constitution, they reinterpret it, and also they imagine what the tenets of America of what Americanism means, and then they try and then make those manifest in the laws and whatever. Which one of those Supreme Court justices would you say is a philosopher who you understand, can get behind, and somebody who maybe even surprises or inspires you?
Well, I don't know the Supreme Courts personally very well, but what's interesting is, Plato wanted society to be run by what he called like philosopher kings, right? He wanted the philosophers to rule, and he didn't want the military to rule. And so, in a way, the Supreme Court, in the imagination of Americans, is kind of like that. They are scholars and thinkers who try to set out laws that we all can live by. Um, what's been amazing, of course, is the role of the Supreme Court has changed over the past 40 years because fewer and fewer legislators, lawmakers, want to take risks by voting for controversial laws or policies. And so there's been a big push to put everything controversial into the lap of the Supreme Court. And that's why you have this major debate among the left and the right that they're, so-called legislating from the bench, that laws and policies are being made by these philosopher kings rather than the legislators. So I think that's something that Americans really need to keep thinking through is how can we make sure that laws are created by figures accountable to us, and we don't abdicate that responsibility to our legal masters.
One of the things which I think is quite marked about America and the American condition is that since the foundation of the American state, you've kind of been slightly anti-intellectual, right? It's a case of get out there, just go do it, go find your space, go west, be what you can be. This is me being a Brit looking in from the outside. You're the philosopher, you're the intellectual. Is American society, is American, the political thought of America, do you think it is denuded of philosophers and of intellectual thought?
Americans are skeptical of elite education, or maybe even elite status. So the core value of America is democracy. All men are created equal. And that sits in tension with hierarchies of excellence, or hierarchies of status. And so when you have an expert or a scholar say, hey, regular Joe, I've studied this for 20 years. I know what the right answer is. There's a strand of American thing that says, I don't care who you are, like we're equal and my opinion counts the same as yours. So the tension of a kind of natural aristocracy, the idea that people could, we could have an aristocracy not by blood, but by achievement and talent. That is an ideal that many people ascribe to, but for a number of reasons, it's been challenged over the years, because what ends up happening is experts, so-called experts, they hide their values in the language of technocratic expertise. So they say, this is not a political question. This is just what the data says. It actually sometimes does embed in their value choices about how one should live, urban versus rural life, religious versus secular life. And so all the people who have been suffering by technocratic policies over the past 30 years basically are saying, I don't care if you go to Harvard, your policies are harming me or harming my way of life, and I'm not going to respect it anymore. And so there's just less deference to experts for a number of reasons.
Do you bemoan that the fact that there's less deference to people who've gone out and studied something for years and actually know what they're talking about? It's marked for me looking at the fact that America has suffered the way that it has with the COVID-19 pandemic, that there's been a pushing aside of people who are expert.
I think there's some good things about our populist moment. I do think that coastal elites have not paid attention to economic inequality or racial inequality. And so I do think it's good that we have a democratic system that through street protests or through the ballot box can push back. The elite class wanted Hillary Clinton. She was everything that they loved: elite education, elite tastes, everything about her. But a lot of neoliberal democratic policies harmed people who were struggling, and constant warfare was something that people were sick of, and she was definitely more of a war hawk. And so, there's complicated reasons why we see the election of populists around the world, but one of them is experts have not paid attention at all to inequality. It serves them because they're the winners. And so it's basically a new royal class that needs to be overthrown by the peasants.
That is very eloquently and poetically put, sir. You are going to be presenting at Intelligent Speech on June 27th. What are you going to be presenting and why?
I'll be talking about how we construct narratives of science and narratives of truth, and how it is that there can be no objective truth, but that's still okay.
Oh, well, you know what? I'll look forward to that, Zachary Davis. Ralph GT, thank you for staying with us all the way through our broadcast. And you said feelings over rational thought. Unfortunately, that's the American way. Feelings or failings, I'm not quite, I don't know if that's what you meant, but thank you, Ralph GT, for staying with Zachary Davis and I. And hopefully, Ralph, will see you at Intelligent Speech. Intelligent Speech is a conference which will be happening online on June 27th, Saturday, June 27th, from 10 Eastern until 6, 10 Eastern AM until 6 Eastern PM. You'll have over 40 different podcasters and great thought leaders, just like Zachary Davis. Zach, thank you for coming on to Intelligent Speech.
Thank you so much. Look forward to seeing everyone there.